After World War II, the victorious Allies decided to celebrate by creating the most awkwardly designed city administration in human history. They took Berlin, the former heart of the Reich, and split it into 4 pieces like a weird little pizza. Then, in a stroke of absolute genius, they placed this entire city deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. This meant West Berlin, controlled by the Americans, British, and French, became a tiny island of capitalism floating in a giant Red Sea, over 100 miles from the nearest friendly border. Nothing could possibly go wrong with a setup like that. The core of the problem wasn't guns, it was money, specifically useless money. The old German Reichsmark was so worthless people were literally using it as wallpaper. The real currency on the street was American cigarettes. So the Western powers decided to introduce a stable new currency, the Deutschmark, into their sectors to get the economy moving again. The Soviets saw this as an economic invasion. They viewed this new, powerful currency flooding into Berlin as a direct threat to their control. In response, they whipped up their own currency, the Ostmark, and declared it the only legal tender for the whole city. A Cold War staring contest had just begun, and the first shots were fired from a printing press. Before dropping the iron hammer, the Soviets engaged in a masterclass of passive aggression. Starting in early 1948, supply routes to West Berlin started experiencing issues. A bridge would suddenly need urgent repairs. A rail line would be closed for technical maintenance. Western military trains were stopped and boarded for inspection with paperwork checks that took an eternity. It was the geopolitical equivalent of your roommate leaving their dishes in the sink for a week. They weren't openly declaring war. They were just making life absolutely miserable in the hopes you'd give up and move out. On June 24, 1948, the subtlety ended. Stalin got tired of the games and decided to just turn everything off. All rail, road, and canal access to West Berlin from the west was severed. But the real gut punch was the electricity. The city's main power station was in the Soviet sector, and they just flipped the switch. 2.5 million people in the western sectors were suddenly left with about 36 days of food and 45 days of coal. The Soviet plan was simple: starve the city into submission. Let the Berliners get cold and hungry enough to kick the Western Allies out themselves. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly logical. In Washington and London, panic set in. The options were all terrible. Option 1, abandon Berlin. This would be a catastrophic humiliation, telling the world that America and its allies would fold at the first sign of trouble. Option 2, send armed convoys down the Autobahn and start World War III. This was also not ideal. The American military governor in Germany, Lucius D. Clay, famously said, "When Berlin falls, West Germany will be next." He was dead set against leaving. Then someone, possibly as a joke at first, brought up option 3. What if we just flew everything in? The initial math for an airlift was genuinely insane. To keep the city alive, not comfortable, just alive, it needed a minimum of 4,500 tons of supplies per day. The primary plane available at the start was the C-47 Skytrain, the workhorse of WW2. Its maximum payload was about 3.5 tons. You do the math. That's over 1,000 flights every single day into 2 small airports. The Royal Air Force's commander was asked if he could pull it off. He reportedly responded that it was impossible. General Clay basically told them to try anyway. The Berlin Airlift, or Luftbrücke, was born not out of confidence, but out of sheer desperation. Supplying a city by air is, to put it mildly, not cost-effective. You're essentially using the most expensive form of transportation to deliver the cheapest, bulkiest goods imaginable. They were flying in coal, actual tons of dusty, heavy coal. The real hero of the airlift became the C-54 Skymaster, which could carry about 10 tons, a huge improvement. Still, the operation was a logistical ballet choreographed by madmen. Planes took off and landed with stopwatch precision, sometimes only 3 minutes apart, 24 hours a day in 3 narrow air corridors. The cost ballooned to over $224 million. That's about $2.7 billion in today's money. All to prove a point that you can't just starve a city into changing its mind. For the Berliners, life was grim, but defiant. They were getting 4 hours of electricity a day. Their diet consisted largely of dehydrated potatoes, powdered eggs, and bread made from low-quality flour. Yet their morale was astonishingly high. This was helped by small acts of humanity, like Operation Little Vittles. An American pilot named Gail Halverson started dropping candy attached to tiny parachutes to kids near the airport. Soon, it became an officially sanctioned morale booster. Berliners organized their lives around the drone of approaching planes, a sound that meant survival, not destruction. The Soviets offered an easy way out, ration cards for anyone willing to register in their sector, but fewer than 2% of West Berliners took the offer. The Soviets assumed the airlift would collapse under its own weight, especially once winter hit. They were wrong. The Allies perfected their system, even building an entire new airport, Tegel, in just 90 days, with the help of Berlin volunteers. Meanwhile, the West decided to play the same economic game. They launched a counter-blockade, stopping all strategic exports from their zones into the Soviet bloc. This turned out to be far more damaging than Stalin had anticipated. The Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe desperately needed things like steel, industrial machinery, and ball bearings from the West. Suddenly, the economic pain was flowing both ways. The blockade wasn't just isolating Berlin, it was starting to cripple the Soviets' own rebuilding efforts. The breaking point came in the spring of 1949. The airlift had become a relentlessly efficient machine. To prove a point, the organizers planned a record-breaking push for Easter weekend. In a 24-hour period known as the Easter Parade, they flew 1,398 flights and delivered nearly 13,000 tons of supplies. That was almost 3 times the daily minimum needed for survival. It was a staggering demonstration of industrial and logistical power. They weren't just sustaining the city anymore. They were showing they could do this forever and do it better every month. The message to Moscow was clear: this isn't working. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic treaty. The Cold War rarely works that way. Instead, a Soviet diplomat casually mentioned to an American counterpart at the United Nations that the whole blockade business seemed to be solvable. After some quiet back-channel talks, the deal was struck. At 1 minute past midnight on May 12, 1949, almost 11 months after it began, the Soviets lifted the barriers. The first British truck convoy drove into Berlin to thunderous applause. The economic siege had failed. The West had won the first major confrontation of the Cold War without firing a single shot, proving that sometimes the best weapon is a cargo plane full of powdered milk. The blockade was a spectacular failure for Stalin, with consequences he never intended. Instead of driving the West out, it solidified their presence and made them heroes to the German people. It accelerated the formal creation of two separate German states, the Federal Republic of Germany in the West and the German Democratic Republic in the East. Berlin remained a divided city, a flashpoint for decades to come, eventually leading to a wall made of concrete instead of just checkpoints. The blockade set the rules for the Cold War, a brutal, high-stakes game of economic and political chess where millions of lives could hang in the balance, all decided by who blinked first. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!